January the 7th, 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Yard, territory of Hawaii. The smell of scorched metal still clings to the morning air. 31 days have passed since the strike that shattered America's Pacific Fleet, and amid the skeletal remains of battleships, Japanese intelligence officers photograph the wreckage with methodical precision. Lieutenant Commander Suguru Suzuki stands on the edge of Ford Island, his boots crunching against debris, watching salvage crews work in the oily water. He writes in his field journal, "The Americans gather their broken toys like children. They do not understand finality." Around him, other officers nod in agreement, their confidence absolute. They have studied the maps, calculated the tonnages, measured the distances. They believe they have delivered a wound from which the industrial giant cannot recover. What none of them comprehend, what their training, their doctrine, their entire cultural framework cannot allow them to see, is that they have awakened something far more dangerous than a military. They have provoked the full economic and industrial fury of a nation they fundamentally misunderstood. The miscalculation did not begin at Pearl Harbor. It began decades earlier in the carefully curated narratives fed to Japanese military academies, in the dismissive reports sent back by naval attachés stationed in Washington and Los Angeles, in the philosophical framework that refused to reconcile industrial capacity with warrior spirit. Throughout the 1930s, as Japan expanded into Manchuria and then deeper into China, its military leadership consumed a steady diet of propaganda that painted America as soft, decadent, spiritually hollow. The Japanese Naval Staff College taught that Americans lacked Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, and that their reliance on material comfort made them incapable of sustaining a long war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, one of the few voices of caution, had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had driven across the American continent, visited factories in Detroit, walked among the oil derricks of Texas. In private conversations, he warned the high command, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant." But his warnings were drowned beneath the roar of a nation intoxicated by its own mythology. The officers who had never seen an American assembly line, who had never stood in a Midwestern wheat field stretching to the horizon, who had never witnessed the casual abundance of a California supermarket, these men made policy, and their ignorance would cost Japan everything. They expected America to negotiate. This was the core assumption underlying their entire strategy. The architects of the Pearl Harbor attack believed that a devastating opening blow would create such shock, such immediate material loss, that American public opinion would turn isolationist, would demand peace terms, would accept a new order in the Pacific. They had studied American history, selectively focusing on the anti-war movements during World War I, the reluctance to enter European conflicts, the powerful isolationist sentiment in the Midwest. They read American newspapers and saw the debates, the divisions, the vocal opposition to foreign entanglement. What they failed to understand was the difference between reluctance and inability, between democratic debate and national paralysis. The Japanese High Command mistook the messy public discourse of democracy for weakness. They could not conceive that a nation which argued so loudly in peacetime could unite so completely in war. They expected diplomacy. They received Detroit. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the transformation was already visible to those willing to see. American factories that had been producing automobiles began retooling for tanks. Shipyards that built pleasure craft started laying keels for destroyers. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it, was not a metaphor. It was a statement of industrial reality that Japanese planners had catastrophically underestimated. In 1941, Japan produced approximately 1,080 aircraft. That same year, the United States produced over 19,000. By 1944, American factories would produce more than 96,000 aircraft in a single year. The numbers were not just larger, they existed in a different order of magnitude, a different conceptual universe. Japanese officers had calculated tonnage and compared fleet sizes. What they had not calculated was the speed at which America could replace losses, the efficiency with which it could mobilize resources, the sheer surplus capacity waiting dormant in its civilian economy. The first Japanese prisoners of war brought back reports that their commanders dismissed as propaganda or psychological breakdown. Captured at Guadalcanal in late 1942, they described American rations with something approaching disbelief. Private Takeshi Yamamoto, taken prisoner in October, told interrogators about the sea rations, canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes, powdered coffee, sugar. He described how American soldiers discarded half-eaten cans, threw away portions they didn't want, treated food with a casualness that seemed obscene to men who had been subsisting on rice balls and dried fish. The interrogation reports noted his fixation on a single detail. The American soldiers fed their prisoners the same rations they ate themselves. To Yamamoto, raised in a military culture where deprivation built character, and officers routinely beat enlisted men for perceived softness, this made no sense. He told his interrogators, "They treat war like a business. Everything is counted, measured, delivered on schedule. Even their kindness is industrial." His captors filed the report. In Tokyo, staff officers read it and concluded the prisoners had been brainwashed. The alternative, that everything they believed about American weakness was wrong, was unthinkable, but the evidence mounted battle by battle, island by island. At Midway, in June 1942, the Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. American codebreakers had read their plans, American dive bombers had caught their carriers vulnerable during refueling operations, and American industrial capacity meant those carrier losses were catastrophic in a way Japanese planners had never anticipated. Japan could not replace those ships quickly. The United States already had new carriers under construction, their hulls taking shape in shipyards from Newport News to San Francisco. The USS Essex, lead ship of a class that would eventually number 24 carriers, was launched in July 1942. By war's end, the United States would have built more than 100 aircraft carriers of all types. Japan, starting the war with 10 carriers, would complete 15 more during the entire conflict, many of them converted from other vessel types, smaller and less capable than the American fleet carriers rolling off the assembly lines with mechanical regularity. Japanese officers began referring to American naval strength as Umi no Arashi, ocean storm, because it seemed as relentless and uncontrollable as weather itself. The disconnect between expectation and reality created a psychological fracture in Japanese military thinking. Soldiers indoctrinated to believe in spiritual superiority over material advantage found themselves facing an enemy that possessed both the industrial capacity they lacked and a ruthless efficiency in applying it. Japanese tactics emphasized individual courage, night attacks, bayonet charges, death before surrender. American tactics emphasized firepower, logistics, air superiority, overwhelming force. At Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese defenders fought with fanatical determination, turning the tiny atoll into a bloodbath. Of the 4,800 Japanese troops garrisoning the island, only 17 were captured alive. American casualties were severe, more than 3,000 killed or wounded, but the United States learned, adapted, improved its amphibious doctrine. 3 months later, at Kwajalein, American casualties dropped by 2/3, while Japanese resistance proved equally futile. The learning curve was industrial, methodical, relentless. Japan could produce brave soldiers. America could produce systems. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese accounts of the war was not a weapon, but a can. The simple American tin can, mass-produced by the billions, represented an abundance that Japanese industry could not match, and Japanese culture struggled to comprehend. While American troops ate canned fruit cocktail and complained about the monotony of Spam, Japanese soldiers foraged for roots and, in the final desperate campaigns, resorted to cannibalism. On Guadalcanal, Japanese troops nicknamed the island Gatu, Starvation Island. Their supply lines cut by American air and naval power, elite Japanese units starved in the jungle while American positions received regular supply drops. Japanese after-action reports noted that American garbage pits contained more edible material than their own rations. One officer, writing in his diary before dying of malnutrition in January 1943, described finding an American camp. They had abandoned dozens of tins. We opened them with our bayonets. Peaches, they had left peaches. The casual plenty, the industrial abundance, the sheer surplus that allowed American forces to airdrop supplies even to isolated outposts. This was warfare conducted at a level of logistical sophistication that Japan, with its limited industrial base and overstretched supply lines, could never match. By 1944, even the most ardent believers in spiritual superiority could not ignore the material reality. The Mariana Islands campaign exposed the gap in stark terms. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots rushed through abbreviated training programs because Japan could not replace experienced aviators as quickly as America could shoot them down, flew against American pilots backed by superior aircraft, better radar, and effective combat air patrol tactics. Japan lost approximately 600 aircraft in 2 days. American losses totaled 123. The mathematics of attrition had become unsustainable. Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than it could train replacements. America was training pilots by the thousands in programs that took civilians and turned them into combat aviators in less than a year. Japanese flying schools cut training time, reduced standards, sent teenagers into combat with barely enough hours to qualify for takeoff and landing. American training programs expanded, built more airfields, produced more instructors, maintained standards. The nation that Japanese planners had dismissed as too soft for sustained war was outproducing, outtraining, and outfighting an empire that had built its identity on warrior culture. The ideology cracked under the weight of industrial fact. Officers who had spent their careers believing that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage found themselves ordering men into battles that were essentially suicide missions, not because death served a strategic purpose, but because retreat was ideologically unacceptable. The Kaiten human torpedoes, the kamikaze pilots, the banzai charges against entrenched American positions, these were not signs of strength but symptoms of strategic bankruptcy. Japan had miscalculated so fundamentally that by 1945 it was throwing human beings at machines because it had run out of machines to throw. American factories produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war. Japan produced approximately 76,000. American shipyards launched more than 2,700 Liberty ships alone, cargo vessels mass-produced using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques. Each Liberty ship could carry 9,000 tons of cargo. Japan's entire merchant marine at the start of the war totaled about 6 million tons, and by 1945 American submarines had sent most of it to the bottom. The nation that had expected a negotiated peace after Pearl Harbor was being systematically strangled by an industrial power that measured victory not in terms of honor or fighting spirit, but in production schedules and tonnage sunk. The miscalculation extended beyond simple industrial metrics into fundamental misunderstandings about democratic society. Japanese propaganda portrayed America as a mongrel nation, racially impure, culturally fragmented, lacking the unity of purpose that came from emperor worship and ethnic homogeneity. They expected American divisions along racial, ethnic, and class lines to fracture under wartime stress. Instead, they witnessed a democratic society mobilize with shocking efficiency. African American workers moved north to work in defense plants. Women entered factories by the millions. Immigrant communities bought war bonds. The messy, argumentative, diverse democracy that Japanese militarists viewed as evidence of weakness proved capable of extraordinary mobilization precisely because its citizens believed they had a stake in the system. The ideological miscalculation was as profound as the industrial one. Japan bet that materialism made people weak, that comfort made them unwilling to sacrifice. They discovered instead that people who enjoyed material abundance and personal freedom were willing to defend those things with industrial ferocity. By the time the B-29 superfortresses began appearing over Japanese cities in 1944, the miscalculation was complete and irreversible. These aircraft, capable of flying higher, farther, and carrying heavier bomb loads than anything in the Japanese arsenal, were themselves symbols of American industrial and technological superiority. Each B-29 cost approximately $640,000 to build, contained 55,000 parts, and required 200,000 man-hours to assemble. The United States built more than 3,900 of them. Japan had no equivalent aircraft and no industrial capacity to develop one. The fire raids that consumed Japanese cities, culminating in the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, when incendiary bombs killed more than 100,000 people in Tokyo, were not simply military operations. They were demonstrations of industrial power so overwhelming that Japanese defenders could do almost nothing to stop them. American factories produced the bombs, American shipyards built the tankers that brought the fuel, American air bases in the Marianas provided the staging points, American logistics delivered the supplies, and American crews flew the missions with the kind of mechanical regularity that Japan, with its dwindling resources and dying cities, could not comprehend or counter. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the final, terrible punctuation on a miscalculation that had cost Japan its empire, its cities, and millions of lives. But the truth is that Japan had lost the war long before. Those mushroom clouds rose over the ruins. It lost the war in the planning rooms where officers dismissed industrial capacity as unimportant compared to warrior spirit. It lost in the intelligence assessments that confused democratic debate with weakness. It lost when it attacked a nation capable of producing more in a single year than Japan could produce in a decade. The atomic bombs simply made undeniable what had been true since 1942, that Japan had started a war it had no capacity to win against an enemy it had fundamentally misunderstood. Epilogue. The empty can. In the archives of the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, there sits in a glass case a rusted tin can recovered from a Japanese position on Iwo Jima. The label is long gone, but forensic analysis identified it as a peach can, American military issue, probably from 1944. Japanese defenders had used it to hold water. Beside it, a translation of a diary entry from a Japanese officer. We boil seaweed and share a single rice ball. The Americans throw away more than we eat. How do you defeat abundance? The question haunted Japanese commanders throughout the war, and they never found an answer because there was no answer within their ideological framework. They had bet everything on a miscalculation, that industrial power did not matter, that fighting spirit could overcome factories, that a democracy built on material plenty and individual freedom would prove too soft for sustained conflict. They were wrong on every count. America did not negotiate. It produced, it learned, it adapted, and it delivered not a negotiated peace, but total victory, written in the script of industrial might and democratic resilience. The empty can, once filled with peaches, somewhere in California, shipped across an ocean, consumed by a soldier who probably never thought twice about it, that can outlasted the empire that mistook abundance for weakness. In its rusted silence lies the answer to how democracies wage war, not with slogans or spirit alone, But with systems, surpluses, and the terrible arithmetic of factories that never sleep,